A rich tourist threw coffee at a royal guard. What followed shocked the internet. Don't forget to like, share, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace. But Sergeant Daniel Mercer didn't move a muscle. Sweat trickled down his back beneath the thick red uniform, yet his face remained expressionless, his posture perfect. 20 years in the military had taught him that true strength lay in stillness, in the quiet dignity of duty. That morning, like every morning, he had spent 2 hours preparing, each brass button polished to a mirror shine. Every crease in his uniform pressed to razor-sharp perfection, his boots gleaming like black glass. The bearskin cap sat heavy on his head, a reminder of the centuries of tradition he now represented. Tourists flowed around him like a river around a stone, snapping photos, pointing, whispering. Children waved, hoping to catch a glimpse of movement. But Sergeant Mercer's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing at all. He thought about his time in Afghanistan, where he had earned his medals for valor. The firefight that had nearly taken his life had also taught him the true meaning of discipline. Standing guard at the palace might seem less dangerous, but he knew better. He was no longer just Daniel Mercer. He was a symbol of the crown, of Britain itself. The crowd's usual murmur suddenly shifted, taking on a different tone. Mercer's trained ear picked up American accents, loud and brash, cutting through the respectful hush that usually surrounded his post. He didn't need to turn his head to track their approach. Their voices did that for him. "This is so boring," a man's voice drawled, the words slightly slurred. "I mean, what's the point of these guys anyway? They're just fancy decorations." Laughter followed, but it wasn't the good-natured kind. Mercer had heard that kind of laughter before, the sound of privilege mistaking itself for power. His peripheral vision caught glimpses of designer labels, an expensive watch flashing in the sunlight, the sort of casual wealth that thought it could buy anything, or anyone. "That's Blake Weston," a woman whispered nearby, too quietly for the approaching group to hear. "You know, the tech billionaire, the one who bought that island last year?" Mercer kept his gaze steady, but his mind was already cataloging details. The way Weston moved spoke of too many drinks at lunch. The cluster of friends around him, all wearing clothes that cost more than Mercer made in a month, had that same glossy, overfed look of people who'd never heard the word no. They stopped directly in front of him, and Mercer could smell expensive cologne mixed with the sharp tang of alcohol. Smartphones appeared, cameras pointing his way, as Weston stepped closer, invading the careful distance most tourists maintained. "Hey, British robot!" Weston called out, his words carrying across the courtyard. "Do you actually do anything, or are you just for show?" More laughter from his friends, but Mercer noticed other tourists drawing back, their expressions uncomfortable. A mother pulled her young daughter away, whispering something about respect. But Weston was just getting started, his ego inflating with each unanswered taunt. "I bet my watch costs more than you make in a year," Weston continued, holding up his wrist. "Come on, at least blink if you can hear me. Or are you too programmed to even do that?" Mercer remained motionless, but his mind was racing through protocols and procedures. He'd dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about Weston's demeanor set off warning bells. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was a tension in his movements that spoke of building frustration. A small crowd was gathering now, phones recording what everyone sensed was about to become a situation. Weston's friends had spread out in a loose semicircle, their initial amusement giving way to a mix of embarrassment and anticipation. But their leader was too far gone in his own sense of entitlement to notice or care. "You know what?" Weston said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "I think we need to test if there's actually a real person in there. What do you say, guys? Should we run a little experiment?" He reached for the coffee cup in his friend's hand, and Mercer felt time slow down. Years of military training screamed at him to move, to block, to defend. But centuries of tradition held him still, even as he watched Weston's fingers close around the cup, even as he saw the cruel smile spread across the man's face. The real test was about to begin, and Sergeant Daniel Mercer knew that what happened next would be seen by millions. He just didn't know that it would change both their lives forever. Time seemed to freeze as Weston lifted the coffee cup. The crowd held its collective breath, phones raised high to capture whatever came next. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs in the nearby trees, as if nature itself sensed the coming storm. "Let's see how well trained you really are," Weston sneered, swirling the cup in his hand. The liquid inside sloshed dangerously close to the rim. A few drops splattered on the pristine cobblestones, dark spots against the ancient stone. "I mean, what are they going to do? Fire you for moving?" His friends had started to shift uncomfortably. One of them, a woman in a designer dress, touched his arm. "Blake, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Sarah," he snapped, shrugging her off. "I'm just having a little fun. Don't be such a buzzkill." The woman stepped back, her face flushing red. Another member of their group, a tall man in an expensive suit, cleared his throat. "Come on, man. You've had your fun. Let's get out of here." But Weston wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had taken on that glazed, determined look that wealthy men got when they were about to do something monumentally stupid. Mercer had seen that look before, in war zones and bars and places where people thought money could buy them immunity from consequences. "Hey, tin soldier," Weston called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I've got a little present for you, something to wake you up." A child in the crowd started crying. Her mother tried to hurry her away, but the press of people had grown too thick. Everyone sensed what was coming, but no one moved to stop it. They were all caught in the gravity of the moment, trapped in the orbit of Weston's cruelty. Mercer's training kicked into overdrive. His muscles tensed imperceptibly beneath his uniform, ready for whatever came next. But his face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the distant point they had been trained to watch. He could hear his old drill sergeant's voice in his head. "The uniform isn't just cloth and buttons, lad. It's armor for your dignity." Weston took a step closer, close enough that Mercer could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. "You think standing here like a statue makes you special, but you're just a prop, a tourist attraction, and I'm going to prove it." The coffee cup rose higher. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Don't!" But it was too late. With a fluid motion born of malice and alcohol, Weston flung the contents of the cup directly at Mercer's chest. Time snapped back to normal speed as the hot liquid splashed across the scarlet tunic. Dark brown stains spread across the fabric, dripping down onto the perfectly polished boots. The smell of coffee filled the air, mixing with the gasps and murmurs of the horrified crowd. For one eternal moment, everything was still. Then Weston started laughing, a harsh, triumphant sound that bounced off the palace walls. "Look," he crowed, turning to his friends. He didn't even blink. They really did program the humanity right out of him. But his friends weren't laughing anymore. They were backing away, their faces masks of horror and embarrassment. The crowd had gone deathly quiet, every phone and camera trained on the scene. Somewhere in the distance, rapid footsteps could be heard approaching. Inside his coffee-stained uniform, Sergeant Daniel Mercer remained perfectly still. But in his mind, a decision was forming. 20 years of military service, countless hours of standing guard, centuries of tradition, all of it had led to this moment. And for the first time in his career as a Royal Guard, he was about to break protocol. The coffee was still hot enough to burn through his uniform, but Mercer didn't flinch. Instead, he let the discomfort fuel his focus. The crowd around them had grown larger, their phones recording every second. In the distance, he could hear the sharp clicks of boots on stone. Palace security was on their way, but they weren't who Mercer was waiting for. Weston was still playing to his audience, though that audience had turned against him. "Come on, what's the matter with everyone? It's just a little coffee. These guys are paid to stand here and look pretty. It's not like they're real soldiers." A small girl pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She couldn't have been more than 7, her face streaked with tears as she looked up at Mercer. "Are you okay, mister?" she asked, her voice trembling. That's when Mercer heard it, the sound he'd been waiting for. The measured, deliberate footsteps of Captain James Harrison, commander of the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. The crowd parted like water as the captain approached, his presence commanding immediate respect. Weston, his back to the approaching officer, didn't notice. He was too busy trying to get his friends to laugh along with him, but they were already edging away, trying to distance themselves from what they now realized was a serious situation. Captain Harrison stopped precisely 3 paces behind Weston. His voice, when it came, cut through the air like a knife. "Sergeant Mercer, you have permission to move." The words sent a ripple through the crowd. Phones were raised higher. People pushed forward, not wanting to miss what was about to happen. Even Weston, finally sensing the shift in atmosphere, turned around. With practiced precision, Mercer executed a quarter turn. His eyes, when they met Weston's, were calm and steady. The American took an involuntary step back, suddenly very sober and very aware of the coffee stains on Mercer's uniform. "Mr. Blake Weston," Mercer said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The fact that he knew Weston's name made the man flinch. "You seem to have some misconceptions about who we are and what we do." Weston tried to summon his earlier bravado. "Look, it was just a joke. No harm done, right? I can pay for the cleaning." Mercer's next words silenced him completely. "Before I stood guard at this palace, I served in Afghanistan. The medal you see on my chest, I earned that pulling 3 of my men out of a burning tank while under enemy fire." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The uniform you just disrespected, it represents centuries of service and sacrifice." The crowd was absolutely silent now. Someone had started a live stream, and the viewer count was climbing by the thousands. Weston's face had gone from red to pale, the reality of his situation finally hitting home. "You thought your money made you powerful," Mercer continued, his voice level but intense. "You thought you could buy the right to humiliate someone who couldn't fight back. But true power, Mr. Weston, isn't in your wallet. It's in having the strength to stand firm when others try to break you." Captain Harrison stepped forward. "Palace security will escort you from the grounds, Mr. Weston. You'll be hearing from the Crown's legal representatives regarding your actions today." But Mercer wasn't finished. He reached up with one white-gloved hand and wiped a drop of coffee from his chest. "You wanted to test if there was a real person behind this uniform? Well, congratulations. You found one. And now, millions of people are about to find out exactly what kind of person you are." The internet exploded before Weston even reached the palace gates. Videos from dozens of angles flooded social media, each one showing the incident in crystal clear detail. The hashtag number, Royal Guard Justice, started trending within minutes, followed quickly by number Blake Weston Karma and number Coffee Bully. Sarah, who had tried to stop Weston earlier, was already on her phone, frantically texting their PR team. But it was too late. The clips were spreading like wildfire, shared by celebrities, politicians, and millions of ordinary people disgusted by what they'd seen. This is what happens when money meets zero class. One viral tweet read, garnering hundreds of thousands of likes within the hour. "Watch entitled millionaire get absolutely destroyed by Royal Guard's quiet dignity," another headline screamed, the video beneath it already at 2 million views and climbing. Palace security had to clear a path through the growing crowd to escort Weston out. People weren't just filming anymore. They were shouting, their voices a mix of anger and mockery. Someone threw an empty coffee cup that bounced off his expensive jacket, leaving a stain of its own. "How does it feel?" someone yelled from the crowd. "Not so funny now, is it?" Weston's face had turned an unhealthy shade of gray. His designer shoes scuffed against the cobblestones as security hurried him along, his previous swagger replaced by something close to fear. He tried to pull his jacket up to hide his face, but it was pointless. The damage was done. Back at his post, Sergeant Mercer had resumed his stance, as still and dignified as ever, despite the coffee stains on his uniform. But something had changed. The tourists viewing him now weren't just seeing a guard. They were seeing a hero. Parents were pointing him out to their children, explaining what they'd just witnessed. "That's what real strength looks like," one father told his son. "Not the money, not the shouting, the dignity." The little girl who had asked if he was okay came forward again, this time holding a tissue in her small hand. Her mother tried to pull her back, but Captain Harrison gave a subtle nod. With tears still in her eyes, she held the tissue up toward Mercer's uniform. For the second time that day, Sergeant Mercer broke protocol. He looked down at the little girl and gave her the smallest, warmest smile. "Thank you," he said softly, "but this uniform has seen worse, and like Britain itself, it endures." The moment was caught on camera too, quickly becoming the second wave of viral content. From standing against bullies to comforting children, this is what a real hero looks like, read one post that would later be shared millions of times. Meanwhile, in the back of his chauffeured car, Weston's phone was exploding with notifications. His company's stock price had dropped 5% in the last hour. Adiara's boycott. Weston Tech was gaining momentum. His social media accounts were being flooded with comments, none of them kind. "Sir," his driver said hesitantly, "CNN is calling. So are Fox News, BBC, and something called Drama Alert. Your PR team says it's urgent." Weston slumped in his seat, the full weight of what he'd done finally hitting him. His friends had scattered, not wanting to be caught in the blast radius of his impending social destruction. Sarah had already posted a public apology, distancing herself from his actions. His phone buzzed again, his biggest investor wanting to schedule an emergency meeting. As his car crawled through London traffic, Weston could see people on the street watching videos on their phones, pointing and laughing. In just a few hours, he had become the internet's favorite villain, and no amount of money could buy his way out of this one. By evening, the story had taken over every major news network. Reporters camped outside Buckingham Palace, hoping to catch Sergeant Mercer at the end of his shift. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trained on the iconic buildings where the day's drama had unfolded. Inside his private London hotel suite, Weston sat in darkness, watching his life unravel on multiple screens. His company's board of directors had called an emergency meeting without him. 3 major sponsors had already pulled out of deals with his tech company. His social media team had locked all his accounts after death threats started pouring in. "Mr. Weston," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "the hotel manager says there are protesters gathering in the lobby. They're demanding you leave the premises." Weston pressed his forehead against the cool window glass. 20 floors below, he could see the growing crowd, some holding coffee cups in mock protest. The irony wasn't lost on him. Meanwhile, at the palace, Sergeant Mercer's shift was coming to an end. As he marched away from his post, something unprecedented happened. The tourists who had stayed much later than usual broke into spontaneous applause. People reached out to shake his hand, their phones still recording. In the guard room, his fellow guards greeted him with silent nods of approval. They all knew he'd broken protocol by speaking, but they also knew he'd done something more important. He'd shown the world what their uniform really meant. "The captain wants to see you," one of them said quietly. Mercer found Captain Harrison in his office, watching one of the viral videos on his computer. The view count had passed 50 million. The captain didn't look up as Mercer entered and stood at attention. "At ease, Sergeant," Harrison said, finally turning away from the screen. "I've had calls from the Palace Press Office, the Ministry of Defense, and 3 American news networks. Everyone wants to know how we're going to handle this." Mercer stayed silent, prepared for whatever consequences might come. "You broke protocol today," Harrison continued, his face unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "And in doing so, you probably did more for the reputation of the Queen's Guard than 100 official press releases." He stood up and walked to the window, where the last of the day's tourists were still milling about, hoping for a glimpse of the guard who'd become an internet sensation. "The palace is officially commending you for showing restraint in a difficult situation," Harrison said. "Unofficially, I think you taught that privileged Pratt exactly the lesson he needed to learn." Across London, that privileged Pratt was learning his lesson the hard way. Weston's phone rang again, his mother this time. Her voice shook with anger as she spoke. "I just watched the video, Blake. Your father and we didn't raise you to be this person. What were you thinking? Mom, I was just what? Just trying to humiliate someone who was doing their job? Just showing off for your friends? Those aren't excuses, Blake. Those are embarrassments." The call ended with his mother's disappointment ringing in his ears. Outside, the crowd in the hotel lobby had grown larger. His assistant had stopped relaying messages after the 100th death threat. Even his loyal driver had asked to be reassigned. On his laptop, the video kept playing on repeat. Each time he watched himself throw the coffee, watched Sergeant Mercer's dignified response, watched his own face change as he realized what he'd done. The comments scrolled past like a relentless tide of judgment. Money can't buy class. This is what a real hero looks like, and what a real coward looks like. Let's see how he likes being the one people laugh at. As night fell over London, 2 very different men prepared for very different evenings. Sergeant Mercer went home to his modest apartment, where his phone was filled with messages of support from fellow veterans and citizens proud of what he'd done. Blake Weston huddled in his luxury suite, watching his empire crumble, discovering too late that some mistakes can't be fixed with money. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but Weston's world had grown darker still. His company's stock had plummeted another 15% in the Asian markets. Weston, his over-party, was trending worldwide. Someone had leaked his private email address, and his inbox was drowning in thousands of angry messages. "Sir," his assistant called through the door. "The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. They're demanding you attend via video call." Weston straightened his tie, trying to summon some of his old confidence. But the man in the mirror looked different now. Scared, smaller somehow. He opened his laptop and clicked the meeting link, his heart pounding. 12 stern faces appeared on his screen. Thomas Chen, his lead investor, spoke first. "Blake, we've called this emergency meeting to address yesterday's incident. The video has now been viewed over 100 million times. Our shareholders are in panic mode." "Listen, I can explain," Weston started, but Chen cut him off. "There's nothing to explain. We've seen the video. The whole world has seen it. Our company's reputation is in free fall. 3 major partnerships have been canceled. Our app downloads have dropped by 60%. The memes," Chen shuddered. "The memes are everywhere." Another board member, Janet Powell, leaned forward. "We're here to inform you that the board has voted unanimously. We're asking for your immediate resignation as CEO." The words hit Weston like a physical blow. "You can't do this. I founded this company. I built it from nothing." "And now you've destroyed it in less than 24 hours, Chen replied coldly. "Your severance package will be generous, Blake. Take it and disappear for a while. It's the best option you have left." Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Mercer arrived for his shift to find something unprecedented. The crowd of tourists had tripled in size. People held signs reading, "Thank you for your service," and "Dignity over dollars." Veterans in their uniforms stood at attention, saluting as he passed. The little girl from yesterday was back with her mother. This time, she held a carefully drawn picture, a stick figure in a red uniform standing tall while coffee drops bounced off him like rain. Mercer accepted it with a gentle smile, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Inside the guard room, his fellow guards had pinned newspaper headlines to the wall. "Guard of Honor, How One Man's Dignity Defeated Dollar Store Privilege," read The Times. "Standing Tall, Royal Guard Becomes Global Symbol of Grace Under Pressure," declared the Guardian. Captain Harrison called him into his office again. "The palace has been receiving calls all morning," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Veterans organizations, children's charities, anti-bullying campaigns, they all want you to speak at their events." Mercer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, my duty is here." Harrison nodded approvingly. "And that's exactly why they want you. But there's something else." He slid a letter across the desk. "Her Majesty has taken notice. She'd like to commend you personally for your conduct." Back in his hotel suite, Weston watched his resignation announcement go viral. His hands shook as he read comments calling for boycotts of his remaining businesses. His phone buzzed. Another message from his mother. "I've arranged for you to stay at your uncle's place in Montana," she wrote. "Away from cameras, away from social media. You need time to think about who you've become." Weston looked out his window at the London skyline. Just yesterday, he'd felt like he owned this city. Now, he couldn't even walk its streets without being recognized and ridiculed. His assistant had already quit, along with half his personal staff. Even his favorite restaurants were calling to cancel his standing reservations. Someone had started a GoFundMe to buy coffee for the Royal Guard. It had raised over $100,000 in less than a day. The money would go to a veterans charity of Sergeant Mercer's choice. The internet, it seemed, had chosen its hero and its villain. A week passed, but the story refused to die. Late-night comedy shows created skits about it. Meme makers worked overtime. Companies started using "Don't Be a Weston" in their advertising campaigns. The incident had become more than just a viral moment. It had become a cultural touchstone. Weston's mother's plan to hide him in Montana fell apart when local news stations got wind of his arrival. He ended up in a private resort in Switzerland instead, where even the staff whispered behind his back. His therapist, speaking to him over encrypted video chat, suggested he use this time for self-reflection. "You've lost a lot," Dr. Peterson said, her voice gentle but firm. "But maybe you needed to lose it all to understand what really matters." Weston stared out at the Swiss Alps, remembering how powerful he'd felt just days ago. "I keep watching the video," he admitted. Not the viral ones, but the raw footage. The way he just stood there. The way he spoke. I've never met anyone like that. Someone who couldn't be bought? Dr. Peterson suggested. Someone who didn't need to be bought. He had something I didn't even know existed until I lost everything. Back in London, Sergeant Mercer's life had changed in subtler ways. The crowds at his post were still larger than usual, but he maintained his steadfast dedication to duty. The viral fame hadn't changed his routine. He still polished his boots to a mirror shine, still pressed his uniform to perfection, still stood his post, with unwavering dignity. The letter from the palace had led to a private meeting with Her Majesty, who thanked him for upholding the highest traditions of service. But what touched Mercer most was the steady stream of letters from young people saying his example had inspired them to join the military or public service. One morning, as Mercer prepared for his shift, Captain Harrison approached him with an unusual request. "We've received a letter," he said, holding up an expensive-looking envelope. "From Blake Weston." Mercer took the envelope carefully. The letter inside was handwritten, the ink smudged in places as if the writer had been struggling with his emotions. "Dear Sergeant Mercer, I've written this letter 100 times in my head, and it never seems good enough. How do you apologize for showing the world the worst version of yourself? How do you make amends for mistaking wealth for worth? That day at the palace, you taught me something my money could never buy. You showed me what real strength looks like. It's not in making others feel small. It's in standing tall when others try to diminish you. I've spent the past week watching my empire crumble, watching friends abandon me, watching the world laugh at my disgrace. But strangely, losing everything has given me something invaluable: perspective. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that the money raised in your name, I'm matching it. Not for publicity. I've instructed my lawyers to make it anonymous. But because it's right. You never broke your stance when I tried to break your spirit. You never lost your dignity when I had none. You showed me what true power looks like, and it has nothing to do with money. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that your silence spoke louder than my arrogance, and your words changed more than just my reputation. They changed me. With profound respect and deepest regrets, Blake Weston." Mercer folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Captain Harrison. "Will there be a response, Sergeant?" the captain asked. Mercer thought for a moment, then nodded. "Tell him his words were received with the same dignity with which they were sent, and that true strength lies not just in standing firm, but in standing up again after you've fallen." 1 month later, the world had moved on to new viral sensations, but the impact of that day lingered. Educational institutions started using the video in their ethics classes. Corporate training programs included it in their workshops about privilege and respect. Military academies showed it to new recruits as an example of grace under pressure. The little girl who had given Mercer the drawing, whose name was Emily, had become something of a celebrity herself. Her mother had started a children's book series about respect and dignity, with a tall guard in a red uniform teaching valuable lessons. The first book, Standing Tall, had already hit the bestseller lists. On a crisp autumn morning, Mercer arrived at his post to find Emily waiting with a copy of the book. "Look," she said excitedly, "it's you." The illustration showed a bear in a red uniform, standing proud while teaching young animals about courage and respect. "The publisher wants to donate part of the profits to veterans' charities," her mother explained. "We thought you should have the first copy." Mercer accepted the book with a slight bow. "Thank you, Emily. You're teaching important lessons, too." Meanwhile, in a small Montana cabin, Blake Weston was learning his own lessons. After his letter to Mercer, he had finally taken his mother's advice and retreated from public life. His designer suits hung untouched in the closet. His expensive watch sat in a drawer. Instead of board meetings and luxury parties, his days were filled with simple tasks and quiet reflection. He had started volunteering at the local Veterans Center without revealing his identity. Cleaning floors, serving meals, listening to stories of sacrifice and service. The old Weston would have considered it beneath him. The new Weston found it healing. "You're good with the vets," the center's director Mike told him one day. "They say you really listen. That's rare these days." Weston, who now went by just Blake, smiled sadly. "I'm learning from them about real strength, real dignity." Back in London, the Palace gift shop had added a new item to their collection, a small figure of a guard in a red uniform, standing straight and proud. On the base was inscribed, "Dignity cannot be bought." All proceeds went to veterans' charities. Captain Harrison kept the security footage from that day in a special file. Sometimes, when new guards joined the unit, he would show it to them. "This is what we stand for," he would tell them. "Not just tradition, not just ceremony, but the unwavering strength of character." The viral videos had spawned dozens of remixes and retellings, but one version had become particularly popular in schools. It focused not on the coffee incident, but on what happened after, Mercer's response, his words about true power, and the way he had turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson about dignity. Teachers reported that bullying incidents decreased after showing the video. "The kids really get it," one elementary school principal said in an interview. "They understand that real strength isn't about hurting others or showing off. It's about standing firm in your values." Sergeant Mercer's fellow guards had noticed subtle changes in the way tourists behaved around them. There was more respect, less mockery. People still took photos, but they kept a respectful distance. The barriers between posts had to be moved back to accommodate the increased number of visitors, but the crowds were quieter, more considerate. In his cabin, Weston kept Mercer's response to his letter in a frame on his desk. On tough days, when the weight of his past threatened to overwhelm him, he would read those words again. True strength lies not just in standing firm, but in standing up again after you've fallen. He had started writing a memoir, not to justify his actions, but to examine them. From privilege to purpose, he called it. The advance would go entirely to charity. His therapist said writing it was a good step toward redemption, but Weston knew better. This wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility. 6 months after the incident, Sergeant Mercer received an unusual invitation. A military preparatory school in London was holding its annual Values and Leadership Day, and they wanted him to be the keynote speaker. Captain Harrison encouraged him to accept. "Your story has become bigger than just one incident," the captain said. "These young people need to hear it from you." The auditorium was packed with students in crisp uniforms, their faces young but serious. Mercer stood at the podium, feeling strangely more nervous than he had facing Weston's coffee cup. "Many of you have seen the video," he began, his voice steady. "You've watched a wealthy man try to buy a reaction. You've seen him fail. But what you didn't see was the years of training, the countless hours of standing guard, the dedication of every member of the Queen's Guard that made that moment possible." In the audience, phones stayed in pockets. Every eye was fixed on him. People asked me why I didn't move, why I didn't react. They think it was about being tough or proving a point, but it wasn't. It was about understanding that the uniform I wear represents something greater than myself. Every button, every crease, every moment of stillness is a tribute to those who came before and those who will come after. Meanwhile, in Montana, Weston was making his own kind of speech. Sitting in a circle with fellow volunteers at the Veterans Center, he finally shared his full story. "I was that guy," he admitted, his voice shaking. "The one you probably saw on the news, the one who threw coffee at a Royal Guard." The room fell silent. "I thought money made me special. I thought it gave me the right to treat others like props in my own personal show." Mike, the center director, leaned forward. "What changed?" "Everything," Weston replied. "I lost my company, my friends, my reputation. But I gained something I didn't even know I was missing. Perspective. These past months, cleaning floors, serving meals, listening to your stories, I've learned more about real strength and dignity than I ever did in a boardroom." Back in London, Mercer was concluding his speech. "The greatest test of character isn't in how you handle victory," he told the students. "It's in how you handle humiliation. It's in standing firm when others try to break you, not for pride, but for principle." After the speech, a student raised his hand. "Sir, have you heard from him? The man with the coffee?" Mercer nodded. "He wrote to me, not to save his reputation, but to show he had learned from his mistake, and that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all, that true strength includes the courage to admit when you're wrong." That evening, as Mercer stood his post, a package arrived from Montana. Inside was a copy of Weston's memoir, not yet released to the public. On the first page was a handwritten note. "To the man who taught me that standing tall isn't about looking down on others. Your lesson cost me everything I thought I wanted, and gave me everything I actually needed. The world may remember me as the man who threw coffee at a guard, but I hope they remember you as the man who showed them what real strength looks like." The book's dedication page read simply, "To Sergeant Daniel Mercer of the Queen's Guard, thank you for standing firm when I needed to fall." In his Montana cabin, Weston watched the sunset over the mountains. His phone, once filled with business deals and social invitations, now held simpler messages, thank you notes from veterans he'd helped, updates from the charities he supported, and occasionally words of encouragement from his mother, who said she was finally proud of the man he was becoming. 1 year to the day after the coffee incident, Sergeant Mercer stood at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace. The morning sun caught the brass buttons of his uniform, still polished to perfection. Though the viral frenzy had long since died down, this day felt different. Special. Emily, now a regular visitor, arrived with the 4th book in her series. The Guard's greatest gift had just hit the shelves. This one was about teaching others to learn from their mistakes. The bear in the red uniform helped another character understand that everyone deserves a second chance if they're truly sorry. "We based it on the real story," Emily's mother explained. "The letters, the changes, everything that happened after that day. Children need to know that it's not just about the mistake, it's about what you do afterward." Around noon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the palace gates. Blake Weston, almost unrecognizable in simple jeans and a work shirt, his designer stubble replaced by a humble beard, stood quietly in line with other tourists. His hands trembled slightly as he waited to pass through security. The guard checking IDs did a double take at his name, but Weston just smiled softly. "I'm just here to pay my respects," he said quietly. He joined the crowd watching Mercer at his post, standing at the back, making no attempt to draw attention, but word spread quickly through the whispers of tourists who recognized him. Phones came out, not to mock this time, but to capture something more profound, redemption in its purest form. Weston stood there for an hour, watching Mercer maintain his disciplined stance. Finally, just before turning to leave, he stepped forward and placed something carefully on the ground near Mercer's post. A single coffee cup, empty, sealed, and wrapped in a note. The note read, "1 year ago, I used this to try to break your spirit. Today, I return it unused as a symbol of my own transformation. The cup is empty, but my heart is full of gratitude." Later that evening after his shift, Mercer read the message. Captain Harrison stood nearby, watching his reaction. "The palace has received a rather substantial donation," Harrison said. "Anonymous, but we know it's from him. Enough to establish a permanent fund for veterans' families and to create a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in military service." Mercer nodded, still holding the note. "Some lessons cost more than money," he said quietly. In Montana, Weston's memoir was finally hitting the shelves. But he wasn't doing a book tour or media appearances. Instead, he was in the Veterans Center kitchen, serving dinner to men and women who had taught him more about honor in a few months than he'd learned in a lifetime of wealth. Emily's books had raised over £1 million for various charities. The Guard Bear had become a symbol of dignity for a new generation. Schools reported that, "What would the Guard do?" had become a common phrase among students facing difficult situations. And still, every morning, Sergeant Daniel Mercer polished his boots to a mirror shine, still pressed every crease in his uniform to perfection, still stood his post with unwavering dignity. But now he stood for something even greater, the power of turning a moment of shame into a lifetime of change. The coffee incident, as it came to be known, had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its ripples continued to spread, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. It taught the world that true power isn't in wealth or status, but in the quiet dignity of standing firm for what's right. In the end, it wasn't just about a guard who didn't move or a rich man who lost everything. It was about how a single moment of confrontation between pride and dignity could transform not just 2 lives, but countless others who witnessed it. And so, the guard stood on, straight and proud, protecting not just a palace, but a principle. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, a humbled man continued his journey toward becoming the kind of person who would have never thrown that coffee in the first place. The story had gone viral for a day, but its lesson would last a lifetime. That true strength isn't in what we can do to others, but in what we can learn about ourselves. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't in standing unmoved, but in helping others find the strength to stand up again.